the story of some of the great Africa men that lives in United States of America. One of them is the world's richest man, Elon Musk. Another one is Barack Obama, and the other is Martin Luther King Jr. Now let's start with the story of Elon Musk. Elon Musk was raised under racist apartheid laws in South Africa. What does he believe now? Elon Musk was born in 1971 in Johannesburg, and McGreal discusses Musk's grandfather, Joshua Haldeman, who immigrated to South Africa in 1950, when apartheid became, in many ways, reminiscent of the Nazi Nuremberg laws against Jews in the 1930s. They have very similar echoes in stripping black people of the right to work in certain places, their movements, controlling them, confining them to areas. McGreal also responds to a new report from Semaphore that the South African government is examining how Musk's companies can invest in the country without complying with the nation's black empowerment rules. The South African-born billionaire Elon Musk is now a leader in Trump's administration and has said white South Africans have been victims of, quote, racist ownership laws, and accused the post-apartheid government of anti-white racism, prompting Trump to cut off all aid to South Africa in an executive order Friday. So, we see Musk's grandfather, Joshua Haldeman. He immigrates to South Africa in 1950, and that's really when apartheid has just started to kick in. The 1950s are when the first laws. South Africa had had discriminatory laws before, but you see the specific apartheid laws, which are much more aggressive and in many ways reminiscent of the Nazi Nuremberg laws against Jews in the 1930s. They have very similar echoes in stripping black people from the right to work in certain places, their movements, controlling them, confining them to areas. You already had a situation which has now, come to the fore because of recent events with Trump. So we see Musk's grandfather, Joshua Haldeman. He immigrates to South Africa in 1950. And that's really when apartheid has just started to kick in. The 1950s are when the first laws. South Africa had had discriminatory laws before, but you see the specific apartheid laws, which are much more aggressive and in many ways reminiscent of the Nazi Nuremberg laws against Jews in the 1930s. They have very similar echoes in stripping black people from the right to work in certain places, their movements, controlling them, confining them to areas. You already had a situation which has now, come to the fore because of recent events with Trump. But also with the sanctions over land, is that the 1913 Land Act had already deprived most black people of land in South Africa anyway. At that point, the 7%, or 10%, as it was, of the population that was white owned more than 85% of the land under the Land Act of 1913. So the apartheid laws kick in the 1950s. Remember that Elon Musk was born in 1971 in Johannesburg, and at that point the Prime Minister was a guy called John Vorster. And John Vorster's background is very telling, really, because Vorster in the 1930s had been a member of a neo-Nazi militia called the OB, which was openly sympathetic and linked to the Nazis in Germany. It was responsible for all kinds of attacks, but including burning Jews out of their businesses in Johannesburg in the late 1930s. And then South Africa goes to war as an ally of Britain against Hitler. The OB and the groups that support them, like Vorster, people like Vorster, they actively oppose that. They actually are in touch with, OB is in touch with German military intelligence, and they plan to assassinate the Prime Minister of South Africa, Jan Smuts, and overthrow the government and have it support Hitler. That plan fails because the Germans are unable to provide the necessary weapons and back out. We are coming to talk about Barack Obama and Martin Luther King Jr., but we need to dive more into more details of billionaire Elon Musk. In 1942, John Vorster, later Prime Minister, stands up and gives a speech, and he talks about the system that their kind of ideological belief system, which was Christian nationalism. And he says Christian nationalism in South Africa is the same as Nazism in Germany and fascism in Italy. It's all anti-democratic, it's all the same thing. By 1971, when Elon Musk is born, that man is the Prime Minister of South Africa. And Christian nationalism is the basis of not only the political philosophy, but the entire education system that Elon Musk is brought up into. So take us from Elon Musk's grandfather moving to South Africa in the 50s to his father, how they gained their wealth. Elon Musk's grandfather moves there in 1950s. He's not particularly prosperous. He arrives without a lot of money. But it's Elon Musk's father, Errol, who makes the real money, principally through investments in emerald mines in Zambia. And, mining conditions in southern Africa in that period were really pretty dire in the 1960s and 70s. Very high death rate, very poor conditions. But the owners got very rich. And Musk lived what can only be described as a neo-colonial life. If you were a white South African in that period and you had any money at all, you lived with servants at your beck and call. You lived in sprawling housing. And what you see with Errol Musk is that when we get a glimpse into just how much money he had, when he and Elon's mother get divorced, she says at the time that, well, he owns a yacht, he owns a jet, he owns several houses. So there was considerable wealth there. Elon Musk's grandfather was certainly on the record in his support for apartheid, very vividly, and he said that that's why he had moved to South Africa from Canada in 1940, was in support of it. Now the grandfather himself is killed a few years later in a plane crash, but it's not known what Elon Musk's grandmother's personal views of Vorster particularly were, but they were both avid supporters of the apartheid system, and the grandmother lived for a number of years afterwards. Originally, the grandparents have no connection to South Africa. They're born and grew up in Canada. And in the 1930s, the grandfather, Joshua Haldeman, he's head of the Canadian branch of a US movement called Technocracy Incorporated. And Technocracy Incorporated is essentially a movement to overthrow democratic governments in the United States and have technocrats, but big businessmen, in many ways, come in and run the country. That's partly a reaction to FDR's election and New Deal and massive reforms that he's introduced in the United States. Now, Canada had its own branch of this movement to overthrow the government in Canada. He, Haldeman, heads that branch. And through the 1930s, it takes on increasingly fascist overtones. They start wearing grey uniforms modelled on the Nazi brown and black shirts. And so, when Canada declares war on Germany in 1939 alongside Britain, the movement is banned because it's clearly sympathetic to Hitler. Then Haldeman is arrested. Elon Musk's grandfather is arrested. They find documents sympathetic to the Nazis and other subversive documents inside his house. And he is sent to prison for a few months, then remains on essentially a subversion watch list for the rest of the war here. So he's basically regarded as a Nazi sympathiser, a fellow traveller. And about a decade later, he moves to South Africa. So after the war, he founds another political movement, which has deep anti-Semitic roots and actually promotes the forgery. But obviously, after the war and the Holocaust, there's no real appetite for that in Canada. It's a failing political movement. And so, his eye casts down to South Africa. By 1950, the apartheid government has been in power for 2 years. And Haldeman looks at it and thinks that's just my kind of place, in which clearly that was what he would want to create in Canada and had been trying to create in the 1930s. And so that's the point at which he and his wife May, they move to South Africa and become very fervent supporters of apartheid. In addition to cutting off all aid to South Africa, news of the region. And that is, Sam Nujoma, the freedom fighter turned president who led Namibia to independence from apartheid South Africa in 1990, has died at the age of 95, often referred to as Namibia's founding father, known for his motto, "A united people, striving to achieve a common good for all members of the society, will always emerge victorious." What used to be called Southwest Africa became the independent Namibia. Talk about Sam Nujoma and how that fits into this picture of South Africa through apartheid. Sam Nujoma was the head of the Southwest Africa People's Organisation, which was the liberation movement of Namibia. SWAPO takes off and is able to have effect after Angola becomes independent with the fall of the Portuguese dictatorship. The Portuguese colonisers leave Angola, and Angola provides a base then for SWAPO to really fight to liberate Southwest Africa. That becomes known as the Border War, euphemistically. The South Africans call it the Border War. They actually invade Angola in an attempt to overthrow the Marxist-leaning government of Angola, but also to keep SWAPO at bay. But the war goes on, and eventually South Africa loses that war. At that period, though, one of the things you see is that Peter Thiel, another member of the PayPal mafia, very close friend of Musk, he had been at school in Johannesburg, but his father gets a job on a uranium mine near Swakopmund, in what is then Southwest Africa. And so Peter Thiel moves there as a child and goes to school there. And the thing to know about Southwest Africa, the reason it was separate from South Africa, is that it had been a German colony until the end of the First World War. Then it falls under South Africa's mandate, partly because at that point South Africa was a British colony. When South Africa becomes a republic in the 60s, it hangs on to Southwest Africa, and it becomes a South African colony. But the population, big part of the population, was of German ancestry. And I remember going to Windhoek in the early 90s, and the main thoroughfare through Ulm. Windhoek was called Hermann Göringstrasse, named not after the Luftwaffe chief but after his father, who had been a governor of German Southwest Africa. In Swakopmund, it was even more extreme. It was notorious for many, many years, really into the 80s and 90s, as a hotbed of open support, continued support for the Nazis and for Hitler. The New York Times has a story from the mid-70s of a reporter pulling up at a gas station to get his car filled with gas, and the attendant openly giving a Nazi salute and saying Heil Hitler to him. You could go to curio shops in Swakopmund, and they would sell Nazi-themed mugs and flags and things, and they openly celebrated Hitler's birthday every May. Thiel went to a German school there. So that's the atmosphere he grows up in. His father is an official on a uranium mine there. And the interesting thing about the uranium mine, amongst many other things, is that it supplied part of the uranium to develop the South African atomic bombs in the 1970s, which were developed in league with Israel. Is that South Africa would deliver yellow cake uranium to Israel. We don't know where the yellow cake came from. It may have come from that Swakopmund area mine, or it may have come from somewhere else in South Africa. But South Africa was shipping yellow cake to Israel at the same time because it too was developing nuclear weapons. And talk about what Peter Thiel has said about all this. Peter Thiel standing up at the first Republican convention that nominated President Trump and supporting him and who he is. Peter Thiel has said of his time in Swakopmund, and particularly the school which he describes as particularly a brutal education, that it turned him against government and into a libertarian. And I think that's an interesting element in all of this, is that one of the things that isn't necessarily appreciated outside of South Africa is that there's two kinds of whites there. There's the Afrikaners, who we've been talking about, but there's a big English-speaking white population. And one of the aspects of the English-speaking population was they, on paper, said they opposed apartheid, but they gained all of its benefits. And most of them, certainly not all. There were some really heroic individuals, but most of them did very little to actually end apartheid. But one of the products of that is you have people like Musk and Thiel who have done very well and whose parents did very well out of the apartheid system, who deny responsibility for it. They blame it on the Afrikaners. They blame it on a government, extreme right-wing government. But then they have to explain how it is that their own parents were so able to do so well out of apartheid. And then they put that down to individual talent, that they're naturally gifted, and that leads them down this whole libertarian path, anti-government path, because essentially they have to explain how they too were benefits of apartheid without taking responsibility. Now let's talk about their relationship, Peter Thiel and Elon Musk. They're co-founders of PayPal together. They both essentially share the same kind of worldview, from what I can make out. They're, libertarians. They're very opposed to any kind of DEI. You've seen a deep hostility to DEI. I think Thiel buys into the same message about anti-white, the war on white people in South Africa, that South African white groups like AfriForum have been pushing in the United States. So I think, philosophically they're very similar, and obviously they have a very close relationship. David Sachs was born in Cape Town in the 70s, and he moves. His parents take him to Tennessee when he's 5 years old. So he didn't grow up in the same milieu as Musk and Thiel, but he did grow up in the white South African diaspora, for sure. He clearly shares the same views. As you say, they're part of the PayPal mafia. They all get rich from the creation of this company. They're all at the top running it. And now Sachs has emerged as Trump's AI and crypto czar, again, part of the same project. And he was a chief fundraiser for President Trump, a big one. The era of the transition to democracy from apartheid. He was so convinced that he was indispensable to the system during Nelson Mandela. Elon Musk left South Africa in 1988 at the age of 18, just as he would have become eligible to be drafted into the South African army, as all white males were at that point, which might have led him to fight the border war that I was talking about in Angola against SWAPO, or it might have led him into the townships, which at that point were in complete ferment. And, you had a huge amount of civil unrest in South Africa at that point. The country had largely become ungovernable. It was under a state of emergency, and the white troops were trying to keep some form of order in the black townships like Soweto. He left before he had to do any of that. Very interestingly, for people who aren't aware, Elon Musk had a company called X.com. It was an online bank. It merged with Confinity in 2000 to form PayPal. The merged company was renamed PayPal in 2001. And you have all of these guys who you've just laid out. Well, I think Botha is a partner at Sequoia Capital, but now key players. And that brings us to Trump's order on Friday to cut off all aid to South Africa and offer refugee status in the United States to the white South Africans who are, quote, victims of unjust racial discrimination. But, interestingly, many in the right-wing white lobby say they want to stay and focus on ending black majority rule. Another bitter truth about Elon Musk many of us don't know is that Musk's biographer, Walter Isaacson, has linked his shift from Obama voter to cheerleader for the AfD to the transition of his daughter, Vivian Jenner Wilson. The significance of this and the alignment now of Trump and Musk.
But let's dive into another great black guy, Barack Obama. Barack Hussein Obama II was born on August 4, 1961 in Hawaii. His parents, who met as students at the University of Hawaii, were Ann Dunham, a white American from Kansas, and Barack Obama Sr., a black Kenyan studying in the United States. Obama's father left the family when Obama was 2, and after further studies at Harvard University, returned to Kenya, where he died in an automobile accident 19 years later. After his parents divorced, Obama's mother married another foreign student at the University of Hawaii, Lolo Soetoro, of Indonesia. From age 6 through 10, Obama lived with his mother and stepfather in Indonesia, where he attended Catholic and Muslim schools. I was raised as an Indonesian child and a Hawaiian child, and as a black child and as a white child, Obama later recalled. And so what I benefited from is a multiplicity of cultures that all fed me. Concerned for his education, Obama's mother sent him back to Hawaii to live with her parents, Stanley and Madeline Dunham, and to attend Hawaii's prestigious Punahou School from 5th grade through graduation from high school. While Obama was in school, his mother divorced Soetoro, returned to Hawaii to study cultural anthropology at the university, and then went back to Indonesia to do field research. Living with his grandparents, Obama was a good but not outstanding student at Punahou. He played varsity basketball and, as he later admitted, dabbled in drugs and alcohol, including marijuana and cocaine. As for religion, Obama later wrote, because his parents and grandparents were non-believers, I was not raised in a religious household. Obama's mother, who, to the end of her life in 1995, would proudly proclaim herself an unreconstructed liberal, deeply admired the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, and taught her son, he later wrote, that to be black was to be the beneficiary of a great inheritance, a special destiny, glorious burdens that only we were strong enough to bear. But as culturally diverse as Hawaii was, its African-American population was minuscule. With no father or other family members to serve as role models, his relationship with his white grandfather was difficult. Obama later reflected, I was trying to raise myself to be a black man in America, and beyond the given of my appearance, no one around me seemed to know exactly what that meant. Obama left Hawaii for college, enrolling first at Occidental College in Los Angeles for his freshman and sophomore years, and then at Columbia University in New York City. He read deeply and widely about political and international affairs, graduating from Columbia with a political science major in 1983. A movie version of his Columbia years, Barry, was released in 2016. After spending an additional year in New York as a researcher with Business International Group, a global business consulting firm, Obama accepted an offer to work as a community organizer in Chicago's largely poor and black South Side. As biographer David Mendel notes in his 2007 book Obama, From Promise to Power, The job gave Obama his first deep immersion into the African American community he had longed to both understand and belong to. Obama's main assignment as an organizer was to launch the church-funded Developing Communities Project, and in particular, to organize residents of Altgeld Gardens to pressure Chicago City Hall to improve conditions in the poorly maintained public housing project. His efforts met with some success, but he concluded that, faced with a complex city bureaucracy, "I just can't get things done here without a law degree." In 1988, Obama enrolled at Harvard Law School, where he excelled as a student, graduating magna cum laude and winning election as president of the prestigious Harvard Law Review for the academic year 1990-1991. Although Obama was a liberal, he won the election by persuading the journal's outnumbered conservative staffers that he would treat their views fairly, which he is widely acknowledged to have done. As the first African-American president in the long history of the Law Review, Obama drew widespread media attention and a contract from Random House to write a book about race relations. The book, Dreams from My Father. A Story of Race and Inheritance, 1995, turned out to be mostly a personal memoir, focusing in particular on his struggle to come to terms with his identity as a black man raised by whites in the absence of his African father. During a summer internship at Chicago's Sidley and Austin law firm after his first year at Harvard, Obama met Michelle Robinson, a Southside native and Princeton University and Harvard Law School graduate who supervised his work at the firm. He wooed her ardently, as memorialized in another 2016 movie, Southside with You, and after a 4-year courtship, they married in 1992. The Obamas settled in Chicago's racially integrated middle-class Hyde Park neighborhood, where their first daughter, Malia Ann, was born in 1998, and their second daughter, Natasha, called Sasha, was born in 2001. After directing Illinois Project Vote, a voter registration drive aimed at increasing black turnout in the 1992 election, Obama accepted positions as an attorney with the civil rights law firm of Minor, Barnhill, and Galland, and as a lecturer at the University of Chicago Law School. He launched his first campaign for political office in 1996 after his district's state senator, Alice Palmer, decided to run for Congress. With Palmer's support, Obama announced his candidacy to replace her in the Illinois legislature. When Palmer's congressional campaign faltered, she decided to run for re-election instead. But Obama refused to withdraw from the race, successfully challenged the validity of Palmer's voter petitions, and was easily elected after her name was kept off the ballot. Obama's time in the legislature initially was frustrating. Republicans controlled the state Senate, and many of his black Democratic colleagues resented the hardball tactics he had employed against Palmer. But he adapted, developing cordial personal relations with legislators of both parties and cultivating Senate Democratic leader Emil Jones Jr., another African-American senator from Chicago, as a mentor. Obama was able to get campaign finance reform and crime legislation enacted, even when his party was in the minority. And after 2002, when the Democrats won control of the Senate, he became a leading legislator on a wide range of issues, passing nearly 300 bills aimed at helping children, old people, labor unions, and the poor. Obama's one serious misstep during his early political career, he later called it an ill-considered race in which he got spanked by the voters, was a 2000 Democratic primary challenge to U.S. Representative Bobby Rush. Rush was a former Illinois Black Panther leader who subsequently entered mainstream politics as a Chicago alderman and was elected to Congress from the South Side's 1st Congressional District in 1992. Obama was not nearly as well known as the popular Rush, and the combination of his unusual upbringing and his association with predominantly white elite universities such as Columbia, Harvard, and Chicago aroused doubts about his authenticity as a black man among the district's overwhelmingly African-American voters. We will stop here for now, otherwise there will be no room to finish up with the story of the world's richest man, Elon Musk, and the great man Barack Obama. Please hit the like button to show your support. Share it with your friends and family to spread our eye-opening extra narrative. And don't forget to follow us, to stay tuned for more. And always remember to tell us something we need to know.